For this last video lecture for Chapter 7, we're going to look at the protective layers of the central nervous system, also the different nerves that serve the head and neck, as well as the ones that stem from our spinal cord. And so looking at what we first protect our brain with, we have several layers. The outermost layer is this skin layer, which we call the scalp, and it covers and protects our head. And what other functions do we have? It helps to serve as our heat barrier, and so we can expel heat and also maintain the heat with our hair. So hair also being part of our scalp. Now, right underneath that, so deeper to that, we have the periosteum, which is that connective tissue that surrounds our bone. And then our skull itself is this harder protective covering of our brain. The next layer is composed of 3 layers. These are collectively called the meninges. The outermost layer of the meninge, this is called the dura mater. Over here and also here. And so the dura mater is actually composed of 2 layers. It's a tough outermost layer of the meninges. So I'm just going to draw that. So here's one, and there's the second one. And then deeper to that, this kind of looks like a little web-like structure over here with all these web-like extensions. This is called the arachnoid mater. And this arachnoid mater and arachnoid layer contains all these finger-like extensions, and those are called villi. And those are going to reabsorb cerebral spinal fluid. And we're going to see what the importance of that is. Pia mater is this innermost layer that clings directly to the surface of the brain. Now let's take a look at the cerebral spinal fluid. And we mentioned last time in the last lecture, found in the third ventricle, we have this choroid plexus. And the function of that is to produce all of the cerebral spinal fluid. And why do we need that? Well, the cerebral spinal fluid, if you think about blood, it's kind of the blood of our brain, in which case, instead of having all those red blood cells, the cerebral spinal fluid is going to contain all those nutrients, oxygen, ions needed to help maintain all the neurons within our brain. And so it circulates into 3 different areas. We have it circulating into the third ventricle, fourth ventricle, and the lateral ventricle. And these are the regions found within and deeper within the brain. Okay, that was a lateral view. Here, let's see a frontal view of this. And so this other picture, let's go really quick. The lateral ventricles, they kind of look like it's just one. Okay, third ventricle is found right in the middle. Fourth ventricle also found within that brain stem. And so here, there's a lateral ventricle, since they're lateral to the side, and we have one in each of the hemispheres of our cerebrum. Third ventricle found within the inside, and then fourth ventricle found central as well. Now let's take a look at the circulation of cerebral spinal fluid stemming from the choroid plexus, either from our third ventricle or from our fourth ventricle. So here's the choroid plexus. And then once this is produced here within our third ventricle, all the cerebral spinal fluid is going to enter through the cerebral aqueduct and join the other cerebral spinal fluid here within that fourth ventricle. Now 2 things can happen. Either as it continues from this third ventricle going through the cerebral aqueduct, cerebral spinal fluid can leave through what's called the lateral aperture. Okay, so it can leave through here, enter into the subarachnoid space. And so what is that subarachnoid space? The subarachnoid space, if you imagine here's all the villi, the subarachnoid space is this entire region between our right below the arachnoid layer and above our pia mater. Okay, so it's this entire gap right over here. So sub meaning below, subarachnoid space, so below that arachnoid layer. Now, in addition to exiting through this lateral aperture, we have this medial aperture right over here. in which case cerebrospinal fluid can also enter or exit from these ventricles. Now, another area that the cerebrospinal fluid can go through is through the central canal of your spinal cord. Here's entire spinal cord. Central canal is a small hole or canal found right in the middle, which allows all that cerebrospinal fluid to go through. And as I mentioned last time, the spinal tap, if you have meningitis, they can excite or take a sample of your cerebrospinal fluid from your spinal cord from the central canal. Now what's going to happen, as we circulate the cerebrospinal fluid, it's going to go through the subarachnoid space, all the way over here, and then finally it's going to get reabsorbed by all that villi from those arachnoid, from that arachnoid membrane. And then from here it's going to exit into the sinuses and the arachnoid sinus, arachnoid villi. And then from here it's going to enter into what's called the superior sagittal sinus. So sinus is going to collect all this cerebrospinal fluid, and then from this superior sagittal sinus, all the cerebrospinal fluid is going to leave through your jugular vein. And it's going to come into combination with your venous supply. So going back, it's going to empty into your heart, and it's going to circulate within the rest of your body. And that's how we can get rid of it. So these are continuously being replaced and replenished. That's how we can clear out anything that's foreign within our brain or any of that dead or dying material. Now here's a case in which some baby at birth can have its fontanelles not fused and have an accumulation of cerebrospinal fluid. And so cerebrospinal fluid can accumulate, and this can be congenital, meaning that it can happen at birth, or it can develop after birth. Now, as I mentioned, we have those fontanelles found between those bones within the baby. Remember, these are those hyaline cartilage connections between each of those bones that don't allow fusion until much later. So because of this, our brain, or the baby's brain, can expand to account for all that accumulated cerebrospinal fluid. Can our brains expand like this in adults? No, they cannot. So it's only possible in infants. And now cerebral hydrocephalus can occur in an adult. However, what can happen is we can have damage to the brain. So why is that? Well, our brain, our skull, cannot expand. We only have sutures in the place of all these fontanelles. And so that being the case, we will exert pressure on the brain. That can cause problems like coordination, balance, breathing, and then also vomiting can be another symptom of this. It can also occur in response to something like a stroke. And so you've got to be really careful as an adult, being very careful not to fall on your head and protecting your head, because all that inflammation can lead to this. Now, looking at the blood-brain barrier, the one part of the central nervous system, all of these capillaries found here within the brain and within the central nervous system are actually the least permeable capillaries of the body. And why is that? Well, we don't want to have any of these toxins exiting out of our circulatory system supply and entering and affecting our brain directly. However, this capillary bed is useless as a barrier against respiratory gases, fats and fat-soluble molecules, alcohol, nicotine, and anesthesia. We can definitely see the purpose of this, especially when we have our under surgery. Fat-soluble molecules, you also want those to be permeable in the sense if you want to ensure the myelination of all of those axons, especially help all those oligodendrocytes produce all those myelin. Alcohol, we saw how this affects our cerebellum, right? As the alcohol bathes our cerebellum, that can decrease our ability for coordination. Now, one thing we can look at also is a cerebral vascular accident. We also know that as a CVA or a stroke. And this results from a ruptured blood vessel supplying a region of the brain. If we continue to draw the rest of the brain over here, oops, that probably should have gone that direction and erase that. And is your arterial supply, here is a venous supply. If we notice here, all of these arteries are going to supply and give nutrients to all of the brain tissue down here. Now let's say we have a rupture right over here. All this blood's going to start expelling here through this subarachnoid space. Then what's going to happen down over here? All of this tissue that's going to originally need all this blood supply is going to be lost. And so what happens to the brain tissue over time? It can start dying. Okay, next thing we're going to look at is the anatomical organization of nerves. We're only going to focus on the cranial nerves and also the major overview of how the nerves stemming out from the spinal cord look like. And so looking at the cranial nerves, we have 12 pairs of them, and of course serving the head and neck. And the only exception to this is the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve, actually, if we look here, it's not just going to serve the head and neck, it's going to extend to the thoracic and abdominal cavities. And that being the case, it's going to really assist us with this respiration. Okay, so I always like thinking of acronyms or just phrases to help me memorize things when I study, because I have like the worst memory in the world, and of course for anatomy physiology you need to practice your memorization of things. And so the way I remember the 12 cranial nerves is I think of this sexy mama or papa over here, Vin Diesel, and I think of ooh ooh ooh, to touch and feel Vin Diesel, good vibes are had. And that stands for all of the different cranial nerves, numbers 1 through 12. And so let's take a look at that. Cranial nerve 1, the OO, is for olfactory nerve, and this is going to be the sensory nerve for smell. So as you can see here, it's found in the roof of our nasal cavity. Cranial nerve number 2, the second OO, is for the optic nerve. This is a sensory nerve for vision. And so we can see that over here. The third OO is the oculomotor nerve. These are going to be the motor fibers that serve your eye muscles. So those are movement side to side. Oculo deals with your eye, motor, movement, so movement of the entire eye, which we see over here. The first one is 2, or sorry, cranial number 4 is 2 for trochlear, and this is the motor fiber to one eye muscle. So also for movement. Cranial nerve number 5, the touch that we saw, this is trigeminal nerve. And the trigeminal nerve will serve sensory for the face. Okay, and also motor fibers for chewing muscles. And is for A, for abducens nerve, and this is for the motor fibers to one eye muscle. So we have lots of them for your eye. Here's another eye muscle. And feel, the F in feels for facial nerve, and this is sensory for taste. Okay, and so for taste, we have all of those glands for taste. What are we now? 8, vestibulocochlear nerve. So touch and feel. Vin. Here's a sexy guy. Vin Diesel, vestibulocochlear nerve. And this is going to serve for balance and hearing. And so when we learn about special senses in the next chapter, we have the cochlea, which is right here, and we have the vestibule, and therefore we have the vestibulocochlear nerve that serves this region. good to represent the G, and that's the glossopharyngeal nerve. And this is going to serve the sensory for taste. Motor fibers to the pharynx. Okay, so glossopharyngeal, pharynx. 10, we have the vagus nerve, so feel good vibrations or vibes for vagus nerve. And this is going to be sensory motor fibers for pharynx, larynx, and the viscera. And we saw that coming down here. Accessory nerve, so this is the R. And this is going to be the motor fibers to the neck and upper back. And then HAD, so H for HAD, and it's a hypoglossal nerve. And these are the motor fibers to the tongue. Okay. And so that's the one thing I remember every student, all the students would never forget this because they got Vin Diesel. Okay. Now looking at the anatomical organization of the spinal nerves, spinal nerves are going to divide soon after leaving your spinal cord. And let's just go over this really quick. So we have all of those sensory neurons coming into our spinal cord through this dorsal root. So we have the cell bodies. We have the dorsal root ganglion bringing all that sensory information in. We can have that interneuron or direct innervation with a motor neuron. From here, we have this motor output through the ventral root. And as you can see here, we actually have what's called the dorsal ramus and the ventral ramus. Now, ramus, what that is, it's a branch of the spinal nerve that contains both sensory and motor fibers. Okay, and so we have the dense dorsal ramus, and this serves the skin and muscles of the posterior trunk. And we have the ventral rami, which forms a complex of networks or plexuses that serve the anterior trunk. And I just want to give you an example. And so here we have this sensory input coming in, going through this dorsal root. From the ventral side, we have sensory input also coming in that's going to go to this dorsal root. Let me just clear this off really quick so we have a better illustration. Okay, so blue is sensory. And so we have sensory coming in from this dorsal region, going into our dorsal region. Ventral ramus also has sensory input coming from the anterior region of our body. Now, let's get red. From here, we have our motor output. So we can have motor output controlling our dorsal or posterior region of our body. And we also have motor output coming here, serving the anterior region of our body. And so what are these rami? It's this region right over here that serves both sensory and motor from whatever region it is of the body. And we have the nerves are a crossover, so they actually contain both sensory and motor from posterior and anterior regions of our body. Okay, so spinal nerves contain both. However, the dorsal ramus contains only motor and sensory for the posterior. Ventral is motor and sensory for the anterior. And the spinal nerve, once again, contains motor and sensory for both anterior and posterior regions. Okay, and so this might be a little confusing. In your textbook, it's going to go over the plexus, and plexus are really these branches of your ventral ramus. And so once it comes here, we have motor and sensory. This plexus will break into whether it's going to serve your arm, whether it's going to serve your leg, your chest area. We're not going to get into that because I realize you have a lot to study for in such a short amount of time. And so we're just going to end here for your Chapter 7 lecture. Okay, and that's all you need to know for Chapter 7.